My name is Jill, as Melody mentioned. Currently, I'm a clinical librarian at the London Health Sciences Centre, which is a hospital. So basically that means I'm kind of like a research assistant for healthcare practitioners. I do a lot of searching. That's my expertise, although I do some cataloging there. And I am moving in July to a postdoctoral fellowship at McMaster University, sadly for my team and I. And it will be moving away from KO theory, so I'm not sure when I'll get to see you all again. So I promise this is the last time you'll have to hear about the food guide, because I know every time you meet me, and like hearing about the food guide, I'm like, gosh, you're gonna die. So as a background to how I'm thinking about my topic, I'm very influenced by Bowker and Starr, and I think that although I do cataloging in my work, the way that I think about classification is very influenced by their works, sorting things out. So they suggest that we have a moral and ethical agenda in querying classification systems because each standard in each category valorizes some point of view and silences another. And so this is a topic that we've heard a lot today of valorizing versus silencing. And this is basically what I think about in terms of classification schemes and the ethical agenda in terms of making those silences and valorizations visible. And I really was also influenced by Hope Olson's work, where she talks about how building a new classification system will just erect a new set of silences and valorizations, and instead could we consider making breaches to the systems we have, and will that help us develop an ethical relationship with our user? So this is kind of the way I see knowledge organization and my project. I'm working specifically on everyday life classification technologies and processes, which are basically the very extreme outskirts of your community. But this is basically my work that's coming up in JDoc, where I talk about classification technologies as non-neutral tools that order the world, and I specifically talk about Canada's Food Guide as one example of a way of organizing foods in this case. And I talk about classification processes, which I think in this community is more often talked about as categorization, how people divide objects, concepts, and groups according to shared characteristics. And I do this through a methodology called Q methodology, which basically statistically groups people according to shared ideas about processes, and then looking at how they organize things in relation to their shared ideologies. But in this one, I'm looking at registered dietitians, which is something a bit different. So in querying food guides, can we think about how they differ in terms of the food groups that they select? So we could think about them as classes. The foods emphasize the specific instances of food that they highlight or prioritize. The shapes or metaphors. We have the rainbow in Canada, and you now have the plate in the United States, and the plate is also in the UK. And their associated messages and their relationship to the political climate of where the guide was implemented. So if we think about the iterations of Canada's food guide, which Canada is the one that I'm most familiar with, if we think about the older version, for example, milk was the big topic, and this is because it was in the post-war years that it was being developed, and there was really strong nutritional issues happening, and there was a lot of research coming out that milk would solve some of these nutritional issues, so milk was prioritized. Now we have vegetables and fruit at the top, and this also correlates with the new research that vegetables and really do have a lot of health benefits. So how they translate over time, is it true that milk was nutritious then, and is it not now? I'll talk about that a bit in relation to food messages across country. For example, this is now the United States food guide that you're probably most familiar with, but it has been criticized by the Harvard Teach-In School of Public Health, which I guess if you're going to criticize the food guide, you have to be from Harvard. We haven't criticized our own food guide in Canada very effectively, but they have done a good job. And they say, for example, that there's no evidence that milk can prevent osteoporosis and things of these natures, and there actually research out there that milk can do harm. So They suggest that the U.S. Food Guide is strongly influenced by food lobbyist groups, is not actually reflective of the evidence out there. And I would argue that the Canada Food Guide is along those lines as well. So, and then we have the Brazil Food Guide, which has gotten a lot of really great press in Canada for the really more kind of overt political nature of it, where they're really asking for, and it's not a food guide, it's a dietary standard, so they don't have like a pictorial representation, but they really ask about the processed nature of food, so how processed is your food, and really you're trying to move the population towards less processed food, and thinking about the impact of food processing on the environment and so forth, asking people to be food advocates. So it's a very different messaging in relationship to food. And so if we query the systems like Bowker and Starr suggest, then I would say everyday life classifications also have these prioritizations, these silences and valorizations of certain points of view. So we can think about how potentially to permeate food guides or other classification systems. Hope Olson suggests that there's kind of parameters for her breaching the limit. So can we make it permeable rather than redefining a new limit? Can we make spaces for people to show up in rather than filling them ourselves? And can we be dynamic and address relevant discourses and reflexive and change over time? So I am going to talk a little bit about health literature today, apologies, because it's off the KO topic, just so that we can fit within the frame of Hope Olson's addressing relevant discourses. So what I'm looking at, what I did in my research is I looked at how do nutrition experts negotiate divergent understandings of healthy eating in their professional practice. So how do they think about healthy foods? How do they deal with people who think about healthy foods differently? What do they think about the food guide? And can they think about ways of modifying the food guide? So I was influenced by Bowker and Starr when I started this study, although I wasn't necessarily influenced by thinking about ways to make the food guide permeable in an explicit ethical agenda. So I have 18 registered dietitians that are in here. 3 were recruited and 15 were randomly selected. And they had 50 foods that are considered healthy and unhealthy by Canada's food guide. They had to sort them in any way that makes sense to them. And then I asked them questions about that and how people sorted foods differently. And I have the interview guide if you're interested. In my research in JDoc, I talk about 4 different thought communities. When I interviewed the registered dietitians, I only brought up 2. One was the ethical vegans, and they, for example, thought that healthy eating meant, like they thought vegan diets were specifically more healthy than meat-oriented diets, and they had very specific ways for classing same 50 foods that the registered dietitians were asked to organize. So, vegan version available, avoid because animal-based, things you couldn't make me, pay me to eat, will not eat. So you can imagine what those things might be. Community-oriented participants talked about eating and sharing food as a wonderful thing to do in the community. And for example, they had ways of labeling foods like local food, gorge if it's season, eat it if I made it myself, when it's in season only, I'll eat it. So the organizing of food was very closely related to the way they thought about food, which is perhaps not surprising. However, if you look at the registered dietitians and the way they organize food, again, maybe this isn't surprising either, but I was really struck by how there was no analysis that I needed to do in terms of their card sorts. 11 referenced the Canada's food guide when they organized food. 3 used the same labels as the Canada food guide, so they didn't reference it, but they used the exact same labels. And 3 used practice-based understandings of health. So maybe I should have done the exercise differently and said, you know, you're at home, you're thinking about food in the context of your life and not as a professional. Maybe they would have done it differently, but I was surprised that it was just basically the food guide. And their understanding of healthy eating that they spoke to me about was very closely reflective of the food guide as well. So eating a variety of foods from the different food groups and so forth. And they talk about Canada's food guide as an important tool to simplify evidence for Canadians. this is the health topic that I'll talk about briefly, but I just want to bring it up because I know that Professor Hjorland talks about evidence-based ideologies as an interesting way to think about sorting or tagging or organizing materials, thinking about articles and how they're methodologically produced. So can we tag them as an RCT or as a randomized control trial or as a qualitative study? Is that a relevant way to organize articles in the universe, specifically in the medical universe? And I have problems with evidence-based medicine. So if you ask registered dietitians, how do you deal with non-standard understandings of health, they'll say all of them were client-centered. So I try to accommodate my clients' personal preferences and choices, but then I try to make sure they're getting all the nutrients they need as well. And the ones that had a strong evidence-based background would talk about, would frame their clients as misinformed or not getting the right source of information. When actually the people that I interviewed were very informed. They read a lot of material about it. They just disagreed. They didn't have the same ideas about healthy eating as the food guide did. So it is, how do you prioritize evidence and how do you prioritize preference and values? And when I asked them, how would you modify the food guide? Some of them thought you should not modify it. It was already comprehensive enough. It was based on evidence. You might confuse people. And some of them thought that there was potential ways to modify it. In Canada, we don't have the plate method, but some of the people thought that plate method was really easy to understand, the concept of you have a plate, what do you actually put on that plate? Some thought adding links to the food guide for non-standard understanding as if eating might be a way to breach the system, if we were going to frame it in that way. And some thought maybe there could be different kind of key messages linked in to the food guide to support kind of non-standard understandings of health. So a brief critique of the food guide. If you think about healthy eating as the Canadian Food Guide does, and arguably the American Food Guide does too, although I haven't studied it in depth, as healthy eating as an individualistic health concern, this is ignoring the fact that there are socioeconomic reasons for why we eat. So you can think about food deserts or neighborhoods that have limited access to affordable and nutritious food options. You can think about food swamps or food environments that are saturated with high energy foods at the expense of fresh produce. So there really is kind of structural elements that you have to think about beyond the individual choices that we make. And also the narrow interpretation of evidence-based practice, where we position evidence at the center of discussion rather than our clients' preferences and values. And there are alternatives to this frame of understanding medical practice, such as evidence-informed practice in person. I won't go into that, but there's more nuanced ways of dealing with evidence and preferences and values in tandem. If we think about permeating food guide, which is the whole, purpose of this paper, I think as I was chatting this morning with Professor Tennis's presentation, I wonder if we can go beyond transparency. And I think that we need to consider managing perceived conflict of interest. So in the food guide, they're very explicit about every aspect of their creation process. They talk about how they're going to meet with stakeholders. They talk about how they met with user groups. They talk about all these different things. Everything that they do and their purpose is explicitly stated, but people still don't trust the food guide because they're consulting with these lobbyists. And if you think about what the Harvard Public School Public Health Department is talking about, their food guide is swayed away from the evidence and towards some of these food industries. So potentially the people who are critiquing the food guide have a point. That's basically what I'm saying. So how do we manage perceived conflicts of interest when we're creating knowledge organization tools? I don't know in the case of library context, like how in the DDC we would manage, for example, our Christian heritage or things of that nature. And then thinking about techniques for breaching the limit. If we're thinking about expert kind of knowledge organization, expert-based technique breaches, I like Melody's paper and her suggestion that we make things hospitable with mitigation. So how can we still keep our systems but make little breaches in it? So could we add links to the current food guide that link out to other ways of thinking about health? Could we, like Margaret Kip showed, have tags and controlled vocabulary in tandem? In PubMed, which is the search database, they have this new thing called PubMed Comments, where if you've published an article, you're allowed to go in and then comment on other people's articles. So is there a way for kind of user interaction with our systems? I guess that would be like Wikipedia as well, although Wikipedia is more user-driven. And could we also have critical information literacy skills so that people are able to read these systems and think about some of the limitations of them? And I couldn't actually think of any user-driven examples of food guides. If you have examples, I'd love to hear them. But there is a general idea in the medical community that medical knowledge has escaped from the experts. It's now out there, and people are creating their own knowledge, and there's a big worry about it. So people are thinking about healthy eating in their own terms. The only example that I could come up with is Flickr. If you type in healthy food in Flickr, people are kind of tagging pictures and thinking about healthy foods differently than potentially the food guide is. The last time you'll hear about the food guide!